For thousands of years, people across the Middle East spoke about beings called the Jinn, not ghosts, not demons, and not the magical creatures shown in movies. According to old stories, the Jinn were beings created from smokeless fire. They were said to live alongside humans, usually unseen. Some stories describe them as intelligent, others describe them as dangerous, and depending on the region, people believed there were different kinds of Jinn, each with their own nature, behavior, and appearance. Some were connected to deserts, some to ruins and abandoned places, and some were believed to follow people without ever being noticed. Over time, the stories changed, but the fear around them never completely disappeared. One of the most feared types of Jinn was the Ifrit. Stories often described them as violent, powerful, and connected to fire. People believed Ifrits could appear in ruined places, empty deserts, or anywhere connected to destruction and anger. Unlike modern fantasy versions, they weren't usually described as monsters with horns or armor. Most stories described something less human. Tall figures made of heat, smoke, and burning shadows. Some accounts claimed the air around them felt unnatural, like standing too close to a fire even when nothing was burning. And in older folklore, people avoided certain places at night because they believed something hostile lived there, something watching from the dark. Not every Jinn was connected to fire. Some stories spoke about the Marid. These were often described as ancient beings tied to the sea. Unlike the Ifrit, the Marid were usually connected to intelligence instead of violence. In some stories, sailors claimed they heard voices far from shore. Others believed certain storms or disappearances were connected to something beneath the water. The Marid were often described as massive and distant, not interested in humans unless disturbed. And that's part of what made the stories unsettling. The idea that something ancient might exist and barely even notice us. Then there were the ghouls. This is where the stories become darker. In old folklore, ghouls were connected to graveyards, ruins, and isolated roads. People believed they could imitate voices or even appear human for short periods of time. Travelers were sometimes warned not to follow strangers at night, especially in empty places, because according to the stories, not everything wearing a human face was actually human. Some versions described ghouls as feeding on the dead. Others claimed they lured people away before revealing their true form. And even today, this version of the Jinn is probably one of the most disturbing, because it doesn't rely on strength, only deception. Some stories described a different kind of Jinn entirely. Not violent, not physical, but subtle. These were sometimes described as beings connected to whispers, paranoia, and fear. People believed they stayed hidden in dark places, watching without being seen. In some stories, a person would hear their name whispered when nobody was there. Others described the feeling of being followed while walking alone at night. And over time, the fear would slowly grow. That's what makes these stories different from normal monster legends. The horror usually comes from uncertainty, not knowing if something is really there, or if you're only imagining it. One of the strangest stories involves something called the Kareen, a spirit said to stay attached to a person throughout their life. Some believed it acted like a shadow version of the human it followed, always nearby, always watching. Certain stories claimed the Kareen knew everything about the person connected to it, their fears, their thoughts, their weaknesses. And unlike other Jinn stories, this one felt personal, because the fear wasn't about finding something in the dark. It was the idea that something had already been beside you the entire time. Today, most people see the Jinn as mythology or religious folklore, but the stories survived for centuries across different regions and cultures. And even now, some people still avoid abandoned places at night because of those old beliefs. Not because they expect to see a monster, but because of the feeling that something might already be there, watching quietly from the dark. And maybe that's why the stories never fully disappeared. Because the fear was never really about what the Jinn looked like. It was the idea that humans were never completely alone.